to Security Analysis. Our focus this week is Afghanistan. And it's a case of Afghanistan again. Because last week we did review developments in Afghanistan before the Taliban moved into Kabul. It's a week later, and there has been a fair amount of commentary about why Kabul happened, how did it happen so suddenly, why did the Afghan security forces disappear or melt away, and above all, could the United States of America have done this withdrawal any better, in a more planned way? And the chaos that we have seen in the Kabul airport, some of the harrowing visuals from there, the plight of women and girls in Afghanistan, the reports that are coming in, much of it is cause for dismay. But there's also a sense of deja vu about the Taliban takeover in September 1996 and what had ensued for those 5 years till 9/11. Today, we're going to look at the United States and its own involvement and the policies which followed as far as Afghanistan is concerned, going back to the mid-70s and from there to where we are now in 2021. And to place this in context and to walk us through, I have great pleasure in introducing and welcoming a very distinguished scholar of the region, Professor Christine Fair. May I also add that she's a very dear friend. I've known her for many years, even when she was doing her PhD. And tracking South Asia. There you are. She's a linguist. She speaks Urdu, she speaks Punjabi, she speaks Hindi, and has other, I would say, languages that we associate with Afghanistan and the region. But allow me a couple of lines to introduce Professor Fair. She's one of America's leading voices on South Asia. She has 10 books to her credit, and the last few books that I have seen, she has specialized not only on the Pakistani army, she's also looked at the terror groups, particularly the Lashkar, and I would say many other parts of the terror ecosystem that is so distinctive to South Asia. And more importantly, I think she's been one of those very credible voices, sometimes a lonely voice, in American academia and policy making about what exactly is happening in terms of the American policy towards Pakistan and many of the, I would say, gray areas. She has been an academic of very high integrity and rigor in drawing attention to the contradictions, sometimes I would say the misleading narratives. And I personally have benefited whenever I have read her and seen her work many times, as I said. Professor Fair, welcome to Security Analysis.
Thank you for having me.
What I thought I'd request you to do is that in the first instance, perhaps you could talk about American, as I said, I use the word involvement deliberately because Afghanistan is a complex region. We know this standard trope about graveyard of and graveyard for empires. I don't want to go that far back. But if we look at the mid-70s as the beginning of the American involvement when Afghanistan comes onto the US radar, particularly after the Soviet invasion of 1979, to where we are now. Perhaps you could give us that thumbnail or overview, Professor Fair?
Sure. So actually, I do want to correct that perception. We did not get involved until well after the Soviets invaded. There's a couple of reasons for that. We were overwhelmingly scrambling to deal with the Iran crisis, which was another crisis that we failed to anticipate. So you'll recall that we had the Iranian hostage crisis. We were actually taken quite off guard by the developments in Afghanistan. President Carter at the time, he was really concerned about Pakistan's nuclear proliferation efforts. And if you look at declassified documents, he was interested in sanctioning Pakistan for the progress they had made in reprocessing as early as 1977. His administration finally put sanctions on Pakistan in April of 1979. Right. So clearly, if the Americans had any expectation of working with Pakistan and Afghanistan, those sanctions made it very, very difficult, because those sanctions would then have to be waived, and that would require congressional approval. So we did this in April of 79. Zia had all the time been saying to President Carter, we are the ones that can oppose the Soviet Union. He was making all of these entreaties to Carter, and Carter really had no time for him. And in fact, because Carter was really concerned about nuclear proliferation, and he just saw Pakistan as a problem, and thus the sanctioning in April of 79. And so that's why when after it was very clear in the summer of 79, just like, a month or so after these sanctions were signed into force, Afghanistan really began to spiral. And at one point throughout the summer, Brzezinski, his national security advisor, said to Carter, "We're going to have to probably put your non-proliferation commitments on hold to deal with this." And that's when Carter famously offered a small package of assistance to Zia, which he rubbished as peanuts. And, for historians, this is kind of funny because, Carter was a peanut farmer before he became president. So we never knew if Zia deliberately did that to,
President Carter,
poke it.
Georgia, right?
Yeah, yeah. So in fact, Zia told him, no, thank you. He understood that Reagan was going to win. And when Reagan came into office, he had to get those sanctions waived. Those sanctions did not get waived until 1982. So if you look at historical data on US outlays to Pakistan, you'll see that they don't really start until 1982. And what most people don't know or remember, or certainly the Pakistanis go to great lengths to obfuscate this, the Pakistanis had been waging jihad in Afghanistan since 1973/74. Why is that? When Daud ousted King Zahir Shah, Daud really antagonized Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who had just, Pakistan had just lost the 1971 war, right? And they lost half of their population and a sizable piece of territory. Daud was very provocative on the Balochistan issue. He was very provocative on the Durand line, and he was very provocative about Pashtun nationalism. And when Daud ousted Zahir Shah and began his process of really top-down driven social reforms, the Islamists opposed it. They fled to Pakistan. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto at that point set up the ISI cell that began the process of turning them into functional militias. Zia, there was a brief interregnum when first it was Zia and, Zulfikar and Taraki. No, it was Zulfikar and Daud. They got really close to an agreement on the Durand line, and then Daud was killed in the Sour Revolution, replaced by Taraki, and then
Yeah.
Zulfi was obviously taken as well. So,
so would it be fair to say that when we talk about jihad and the Pakistani state supporting jihad, we actually are looking at 1973 and Afghanistan?
yes.
That is in many ways the genesis. Okay.
That's where I place it. I was
okay.
And by the way, if people are dubious of this, if they think that I'm just some American blowing smoke up their kurtas, this is detailed in a fabulous book by Rizvan Hussein. It's very expensive, unfortunately, but I have photocopies of the relevant chapters. They can email me. I can send it to them. I use it in my syllabus. General Arif, in his book, Working with Zia, discusses this. And Abdul Sattar, who was, of course, Pakistan's foreign secretary, he says of this that Pakistan supported these jihadis on using its own meager resources without any other involvement, because it was in Pakistan's core security interest to do so.
So Professor Fair, I think this is important that you draw attention to 1973 and Pakistan's support to jihad against Afghanistan. But if you could look at the 79, the invasion of that year by the Soviet Union, and how the United States policy evolves on the Reagan watch. Professor Fair?
Yeah, so obviously the United States goes full in, right? Charlie, we frequently talk about Charlie Wilson as being one of the biggest proponents of this. I think it's fairly well known, right? The United States, for every dollar that the US spent on this war, the Saudis would give $1, and we were, trying to source weapons that were basically Soviet but produced on license to give the illusion of a proxy war. What I actually think is the most interesting aspect is what happened to the American concern about Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. To me, that's the most interesting thing in this period. But so what had happened, because there's a lot of misunderstandings about sanctions, the Pressler Amendment, what it was, what it wasn't. So President Reagan came in, he had to get those April of 79 sanctions waived, right? And that required congressional approval every year. It's kind of noisome. So what was the brainchild of essentially the Reagan administration and the Zia administration was this gentleman's agreement, because what was happening was there were the cold warriors who were, we have to work with Pakistan, no matter what, because we need to make Afghanistan the Soviet Union's graveyard. But you also have these non-proliferationists like Senator Glenn that were like, Pakistan is the biggest menace. And at that time, A.Q. Khan wouldn't shut up. He was saying, we're basically one screwdriver away. And they're like, how can we work with this country when we know they're developing a bomb? And so the Pressler Amendment was born. And what the Pressler Amendment did was it shifted the red line from the amendments to the Foreign Assistance Act that facilitated the Carter Amendment, the Carter sanctions. So what the Pressler Amendment did was it says, as long as the president certifies that Pakistan doesn't have a bomb, we can continue.
Device, that's the exact turn of phrase, if I remember right.
Well, but if you actually look at the legislation, that's not really, so the thing was, exploding a device would make it impossible to say otherwise, right? Yeah. But so as long as the president was willing to certify, and obviously blowing up a device would make that impossible, Pakistan can continue receiving this assistance.
Yeah.
Right. So this meant, so there was never any expectation that Pakistan had backed away from its enrichment, right? We just moved the red line of what was tolerable. And in fact, Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs was involved in this decision and considered this gentleman's agreement which was essentially between the Reagan administration and Zia, to be a diplomatic coup. So what was essentially happening, and I think that people, again, just don't pay attention to this period. We now know from a variety of Pakistani sources, Abdul Sattar, from Feroz Hassan Khan, but even Zulfikar Ali Bhutto himself describes this in his autobiography, If I'm Assassinated, that Pakistan had an actual basic device that could be pushed off of a transport aircraft in extremis between 1980 and 84. In other words, before the Pressler Amendment had even been negotiated. So during this period, when Pakistan is this beneficiary of American largesse, they're continuing to develop their program, right? And so when people say, well, when we impose sanctions under Pressler Amendment, that's not what actually happened. When the president no longer needed Pakistan, there was no need to perjure himself. And at this point, it's going to be George Herbert Walker Bush. And those sanctions snap back into force, right? But Pakistan had already acquired a bomb.
Yeah. This actually is very interesting from the Indian perspective. This is when we have Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi assuming office, and this is after his mother is assassinated. And 85 onwards, we talk about the gap between Pakistan and India, because as we said here in those closed door sessions, and this is all something that comes out later, that the Indian establishment comes to the determination that the Pakistani horse has bolted, and there is a gap which is in Pakistan's favor. And I think much of that explains what you might call as the American reticence to, in a way, confront Pakistan with its duplicity. And of course, we know what happens towards the end of the 80s when the Soviet Union withdraws. And that's when I would say I think we see the beginning of the support to a group like the Taliban, and they becoming, shall we say, we are talking about the Benazir years and the support that is being given by her ISI chief.
Well, this is really the 90s, right?
Early 90s. And
Yeah.
then you see the Taliban taking over. So let me just shift gears, if I may. Can you just talk briefly, Christine, about the American policy as it unfolded during Taliban 1.0?
Yeah. So this, if I hadn't had made so many moves across the country, because I'm actually a pack rat, as my husband will attest. I don't know. I really wish I hadn't thrown this document out. So when I was a graduate student in 1997, right, which is right, the Taliban hadn't fully consolidated control. They hadn't fully taken Kabul. They wouldn't do that until 1998. But in 1997, they were largely in control. So I was given this document, you know, essentially, here's the US policy on the region. We were told, you're an intern, you're not authorized to discuss this, but, if it ever comes up in dinner parties, just make sure you're not an ignoramus. So familiarize yourself with our policies. Because like, what's the expectation that, a graduate student would be so knowledgeable? So it was a very helpful cheat sheet. But what really struck me at the time was the US policy on Afghanistan. And this would then dovetail very nicely with my experiences later at RAND, which is when you and I first met. So the document said that the Americans recognized the Taliban as the de facto government of Afghanistan. And while we didn't necessarily like them, we thought that they were the most likely means of bringing stability to Afghanistan. And there was mention of the Unocal pipeline,
That's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right?
That was that golden port in Central Asia during the Clinton presidency. I remember those conferences when you had Americans,
Exactly.
Pakistanis, and others talking about this huge, pot of gold in Central Asia. But please go on. Let me not interrupt you. Yeah.
Well, they also wanted to build a pipeline through basically equally necessary, but equally politically absurd. They wanted to build a pipeline connecting India's northeast with the rest of India going through Bangladesh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember that. Yeah.
Right.
There were many
So,
stories.
Unocal just, literally, pipe dreams, right? So as a junior analyst at the RAND Corporation, I was brought in on a project about Unocal, and I did the grunt work on it. And, I remember we were in Unocal's office in El Segundo, and we were briefing them on it. And we're like, we have no good news for you. These are just preposterous ideas. And I think it was that day itself that the United States actually sent cruise missiles into Afghanistan, right? Into Khost. So now I remember Unocal not liking what they were told, because obviously they had paid for this consultancy in the expectation that we would be the red team that would get them to yes. And so I'm sure that they were just planning on looking for someone else. But I think, the missile strikes at Khost. But we also now know Zalmay Khalilzad was my boss at RAND. He was the vice president for Project Air Force. And he's actually why RAND had a major but we also now know, that he personally accompanied a tranche of Talibanjos to the Unocal office in Texas. Are these fabulous pictures of him? So I think this kind of presages, kind of where we are today. So in that period, it was exactly as you said, how do we get pipelines were like the future? how do we get these pipelines there? And the Taliban were the ones to make it happen. The difference now is that, to quote Steve Cohen, who is no longer here, we have fought to the last Marine to make Afghanistan ripe for Chinese exploitation. So it's
I
now
think,
going to be
That
right.
that sums it up really, I think, and I'm glad you
Yeah.
recalled, the late Professor Stephen Cohen, because he had, I think, he was a very major voice, I think, in the American policy as it was unfolding then. But let me bring you to 9/11 now, Chris. As you said, I think you have given us a very important insight into one American perception of the region in Afghanistan, which was this whole hydrocarbon issue, which is why
Yeah.
corporate America had got involved and then realized it wouldn't fly. I didn't realize you were the analyst in RAND who put this all together. But 9/11, I think, was the enormity that makes all of America sit up about the challenge, the threat that the Al Qaeda posed. And then you see the interregnum from 9/11 to October of 2001 and the American global war on terror. And I remember you writing about this, that how the Americans lost the plot was that instead of focusing on Afghanistan and Pakistan, the US shifts to Iraq. But you just want to talk about 9/11 and post 9/11?
So, I mean, as an American citizen, I still can't tell you why we went to Iraq. Right. We were given a lot of fictive reasons that were just outright lies. So we know from the Woodward books that this was on Bush's to-do list when he came in, and Rumsfeld described the war in Afghanistan as a speed bump to the war that we wanted to get to, right? He understood the Americans needed to see something in Afghanistan, but the real interest from the get-go was Iraq. And I mean, the most conspiratorial explanations for the Iraq War don't sound so conspiratorial now, which was, Cheney, Blackwater was not Blackwater, Halliburton, which was the Uber company for KBR. They were doing everything on these bases. I mean, KBR was doing the CHUs, the containerized housing units. They were doing the electricity. They were doing the dry cleaning. They were running the chow halls. They were just minting money. And so Cheney was an evil genius, and Bush was kind of a dullard. And when they came in to office, they kind of struck this agreement that Cheney was going to be the international guy and Bush was going to be the domestic guy. But this did have very significant consequences for the Afghan war, because there's, I don't know how it is that we are still a superpower. I guess the other countries just must be even more incompetent than we are. And we just had all this power after World War II that we could fritter away. But, people I knew on on Bush's NSC at the time, they said, if we spent an hour, and everything was under the same banner of the Operation Enduring Freedom, the Iraq War and the Afghan War, just absurd, but they were. If we spend an hour on OEF, we'd spend 55 minutes on Iraq, and the remaining would be dedicated to Pakistan and Afghanistan. So there were just a lot of decisions that were made that would have path-dependent consequences for all future outcomes. So I would argue.
Let me just add to this, because, as you were speaking, I had this recall really that, we had two secretaries of state, Madeleine Albright on the Clinton watch and General Colin Powell with President Bush. And I remember some phrases that we in India, at least those of us who were tracking the US-Pakistan, US-Afghanistan story, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright spoke about the United States standing taller and seeing further, and America as the indispensable power as far as the post-Cold War world was concerned. And I say this with sadness and regret, Christine, because, I've had a long association with American academics, analysts, when I was in the IDSA as a security analyst. And I think one of the lowest points for American credibility and moral integrity as a major power, as a superpower, as a power that sees further, and etc., was General Colin Powell's, the kind of briefing that he did for the UNSC. I don't want to say
Absolutely.
this as bluntly, but he was being very economical with the truth. And we were dismayed
Yeah.
in India
Yep.
because that's when, let me just finish this. We used to say that the United States, is ostensibly targeting Iraq because of a leader who is in the American determination of the Bush team, trying to acquire WMD, weapons of mass destruction. That here was a leader, General Saddam Hussein, who was supporting terror. And he was also stoking fundamentalism. Now, all three elements were applied. I'm just paraphrasing, summarizing, and making it sound very simplistic. But instead of targeting the right country, which is Pakistan, they went for Iraq. And then, of course, you see this whole tragedy. But let me sort of now move this part to the two questions that you and I have discussed in the past. Ineptitude, turpitude, or was there a deliberate attempt, like one of the formulations is that for 20 years, it is not a case of the United States fighting one war, but fighting 20 different wars. That every year with a new team, with a new appreciation between the political, military, and the strategic community, the United States was engaged in different objectives. And a lot of Americans died. I mean, you and I have discussed about the veterans. You're a family that has experienced the pain and anguish of the veterans. So, this is where I often say that how come America, with all its investment in think tanks, academics, really very highly capable people who have followed the Henry Kissinger trail of advising presidents, why did you get it so wrong that your soldiers paid this very heavy price after Vietnam? That's my real question. You want to talk about this?
Well, there's so many off ramps here. So I'm going to just try to narrow it down, because otherwise this becomes an hours long affair, right? So let's go back to the Bush administration. And this is the period that I think I had the most visibility into, because I was at RAND and then at USIP, and USIP did a lot of legitimization of the Iraq War. But I remember even then being a lone voice. I said, Musharraf is an asset that has well past his expiration date. I remember saying he's a check that's bounced thrice. And I was saying this by 2004. So for me, this is very personal, right? I'm not sure, you and I met sometime around this period, but
Yeah.
one of the last projects I did for RAND, because I left very dispirited from RAND when I saw that they were just becoming an organization with no integrity. I was tasked with going to Peshawar in 2004 to learn what the Pakistanis were planning to do in the Waziristan offensives that were planned in March of that year. I was there in January of 2004. I went to Peshawar as a single woman traveling alone at this time. I took a lot of risks. And I came back with fairly serious information that the Pakistanis, specifically, I focus on one area of the border, that the Tochi scouts were facilitating Taliban crossing of the border. And this was, the ISI was on me, the ISI was on my interlocutors. My project advisor was really stupid. So I get back and I briefed Rumsfeld's deputy, and I said, here's the situation. They have done a U-turn, and you need to know that they're not what you think they are. They are double crossing us. They're taking our money, and they are supporting the Taliban. And I was the only person saying this in DC. I remember interviewing with CFR with Richard Haas, and he asked me, well, what do you think of Musharraf? And I told him, he's double crossing us. And he says, well, the person I want to hire for this job.
But I remember you were the lone voice in those years, when all this double crossing was going on. And which is why I think, this is where there is a lot of dismay amongst those who would be described as well-wishers of what the United States was in a way seeking to do after the end of the
Well,
Cold War.
let me finish the
Yeah.
story because it actually gets worse, right? So 2006 comes and this person is now the head of a major granting organization. He calls me up. He says, I'm in DC. I really need to talk to you. And I said, well, I can't take your grant money. I'm at USIP. And he says, I know, that's why I want to speak to you. So I had lunch with him. It was one of those DC lunches. And he says, well, before we talk about business, I first have to apologize to you. When you told me that the Pakistanis were double crossing us, I mocked you. I called you a variety of unsavory words, thinking that you were, you know, a bimbo. And I now know that you were right. I exploded in rage. I said, do you, sir, have any idea how much risk I put myself in? And then to be disregarded as a bimbo? You had all the air assets. You had drones in the air. It would have literally cost you nothing because you already had the assets there. Just what the actual fuck? To this day, I am bitter. To this day.
You know,
And
I
I
think
said,
that was it. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
no, I said, who else did you have? You know, someone who knew the region, someone who actually had a good relationship with, and you know, people misunderstand me. I don't like the deep state. I have deep affection for Pakistan and its people, except those who support the deep state. I said, who did you have who would hop on a bus and go to Peshawar? And who did you have who would do this? Who did you have that you thought knew more than I did? And, you know, it's,
You know,
so the Bush administration just didn't want to see the truth. And it made it so much harder to do the things right after that.
add one line as somebody who would occasionally interact with, I would say, fairly senior American officials, particularly the military, especially when we met with them in Delhi, occasionally in DC, and serving 3-star. And I don't want to get into the names at this stage, it would not be appropriate. But they, again, it is the same thing, you know, which is that everybody seemed to know that the Pakistanis were double crossing the United States. And I remember one closed door session where I would say that the American military at 3-star level was absolutely I would say, furious that the American taxpayers' money was being used in a way to attack and kill American service personnel. I mean, that was the most, I would say, unsavory part. And this to me as an analyst, you know my interest in these matters and my sort of looking at the May 1990 crisis and all of that, that why is it that when so many senior people in the US loop in the Beltway know about this, why did they still allow it to happen? Which is why I think you and I spoke about ineptitude or turpitude or both. But let me just, shift gears again towards the last bit of our chat. मैं क्रिस्टीन मैडम एक चीज आपसे पूछना चाहता हूँ. आप तो भाषा में आप पंजाबी बोलती हैं, उर्दू, हिंदी और अफगानिस्तान के भी डायलेक्ट्स जो हैं. पर ये बताइए आपके ऐसे
अफगान डायलेक्ट्स बिल्कुल नहीं बोलती
हम
हैं.
सिर्फ पंजाबी, उर्दू, हिंदुस्तानी की बात कर रहे हैं. पर आप काफी, मैं कहूँगा कि साउथ एशिया के मामलों में आप दिग्गज भी हैं. आपकी भाषा की भी खूबी है. तो ये बताइए, जहां तक आपके अंदाज़े, in your assessment, if you look at the next few years, I don't know whether it should be few months or few years, what do you see? अगर आप अफगानिस्तान की अंदरूनी जो डोमेस्टिक हालात है, उसके बारे में आपके क्या सोच विचार है? क्रिस्टीन जी.
इसी तक कह सकती हैं कि ज्यादा तो ज्यादा, सब तो ज्यादा खतरा होवेगा इंडिया वास्ते. क्यों? 2 वजह हैं. पहले वजह यह है तालिबान, और तालिबान मुख्तलिफ देवबंदी आतंकवादी ग्रुहां नाल बहुत ज्यादा संबंध रखते हैं. मसलन जैश मोहम्मद, खास तौर पर जैश मोहम्मद. दूसरी गल ये है कि चीन, क्योंकि चीन इस सूरत हाल तो ज्यादा फायदा उतारन लाई तैयार हैं. तो इंडिया दे 2 दुश्मन हैं, देवबंदी टेररिस्ट ते चीन. बिल्कुल उस दे सरहद होते हैं।
यही कह रहा हूं कि आपने इसको बहुत स्पष्ट तरीके से कहा है कि इस वक्त भारत के लिए सबसे ज्यादा इसका असर होगा, इसके जो नकारात्मक या नेगेटिव कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस होंगे।
जी
और आपने जो भी कहा है उस पे मैं एक और मुद्दा जोड़ना चाहता हूं कि अगर आप इस वक्त तालिबान हुकूमत को देखेंगे, ये डी फैक्टो रियलिटी है अफगानिस्तान के अंदर। सब लोग जानते हैं कि अफगानिस्तान के तालिबान में कई सारे अलग अलग गुट हैं। उनमें से एक खास जो मेंबर है वो है हक्कानी ग्रुप।
जी
And I want to bring this up onto the radar now, Chris, to say that for India, it's this multi-layered security challenge for the short term and the long term, wherein you have the Haqqani group, which is the proxy for Pakistan and the deep state, as I see it. Pakistan is the proxy now we have for China. And we know that between Haqqani, Pakistan, and China, their orientation vis-a-vis India, both for the short term and the long term, is not favorable at all. If anything, it is adversarial. We even recall the attack on the Indian embassy in Kabul, which the Haqqani group was involved in. So I think it's very right, और आपने बिल्कुल सही इसके ऊपर रोशनी डाला है। पर प्रोफेसर क्रिस्टीन फेयर, अंत में अगर आप कुछ कहना चाहती हैं, I want to give you the last word before I close this discussion, because there is so much that you can share. It's really the tyranny of time and the way these programs are structured. But over to you for our last few lines, and then I'll close the show. Chris, all yours.
I don't really have any concluding wisdoms. I mean, it's been very frustrating. There's only been a handful of us that have been consistently, like, I refuse to call the Taliban an insurgency because it's a proxy of the Pakistani state. So calling them an insurgency implies some independence of thought and resources.
I've also seen this way. But listen, one word about the girls and the women in Afghanistan under Taliban 2.0, after all these so-called, well-meaning press conference. You want to say something?
Jesus. Yeah, I do. I'm
Yeah.
really exhausted with fielding this question from journalists. Like, well, do you expect any differences? I'm like, no. Why do I expect no differences? Because first of all, the whole peace process where the Taliban became normalized, became sort of like media darlings. While they were saying these things, they were preparing for this offensive. If the Taliban were anything but the kaminas that they were, they would not have done what they did. Right? They would have stood elections, but this is so no, there's no evidence of a Taliban 2.0. And all of their garbage about women having the right to exist under the confines of Sharia. Here's the thing that pisses me off most about the Taliban. Those jahels couldn't read the Quran with understanding. Right? They cannot. Prophet's wife, his first wife, was a very educated businesswoman. In fact, she enabled him. I mean, she was like the force behind him. Had it not been for his wife, we probably never would have heard of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the normative understanding of Islam and the status of women, that's something that's been distorted. But you're right. I think, there's going to be no difference between, at least in my assessment, also Taliban 1.0. But on that note, Professor Fair, allow me to thank you for sharing your thoughts. As I said, you have a very deep water table. In the old days, it was said, trust and verify. When we spoke about Reagan and the Cold War, I often say that with the Taliban, let's verify what they are going to do before we even think about trust in the long term. But let me stop here and thank you. And I hope that, as I said, very soon we'll be able to look at a more stable and hopefully a more peaceful Afghanistan. But that seems at this point low probability. Thank you so much, Professor Fair.
Anand Vich Raho ji, Anand Vich Raho.